Chucky. Chucky. Well, he's seen better days, hasn't he? Before I delve into what I'm about to say about the Chucky franchise, I want to make it clear that I'm a huge Chucky fan and have been since I was a young teenager. I've always wanted nothing but the best for the series, but with that adoration and attention to the details of this franchise comes a lot of passion and criticism. You always tend to criticize that which you love the most, and Chucky is no exception. That being said, there is a problem with Chucky that has been symptomatic of the series for a long time. In fact, there are several problems with the franchise, and I'm going to do my best to lay them out so everyone can understand exactly why I think Modern Chucky is a failure. Not just from a critical standpoint, but from a creative one as well. Bride of Chucky was a fantastic horror comedy, and it single-handedly revived the Chucky franchise into the modern consciousness at the time in the late 1990s. The thing with Bride of Chucky, however, is that it creates another problem for the demonic doll, and that is its direction and tone. The tone. Bride of Chucky was laced with satirical jokes, fourth-wall-breaking gags, and disarming relatable humor that subverted its more horrific undertones. These jokes, however, were kept in check by the overall serious tone of the film, and only taking slight detours into silly territory. For example, we might hear a joke about Chucky noting how it was the fourth sequel installment in a film series.
So how did you end up like this?
Well, it's a long story.
It sure is.
In fact, if it was a movie, it would take 3 or 4 sequels just to do it justice.
Or comparing Chucky to other cultural icons such as G.I. Joe. The film, however, was never allowed to veer too far off track and break immersion altogether, probably due in large part to the fact that it was directed by Ronnie Yu. Self-referential jokes were made to poke fun at the fact we were watching a killer doll do all these unrealistic, monstrous acts, all with the expressed purpose of having a bit of fun with the concept, while still taking the story somewhat seriously. A lot of people think of Bride of Chucky as being a departure from the feel of the first 3 films, but it has more in common with them than you might think. Chucky, and more specifically the Child's Play franchise, has always had somewhat of a comedic bent to it to some degree. The first 3 movies had a serious tone to them with realistically high stakes, all the while cracking a joke here or there, usually with one-liners by Chucky.
How's it hanging, Phil?
The rest of the film stayed serious in nature and left the comedic and oftentimes creepy comments to Chucky himself.
You stupid bitch! You filthy slut! Did you fuck with me?
The only thing that changed with Bride of Chucky was the often self-aware humor and satirical tone the film seemed to acquire in light of the horror films popular at the time. Films like Scream were big at the time for revealing horror tropes and poking fun at them playfully, and Bride of Chucky was no different. Making note of how many sequels there have been, making light of the fact Chucky was a silly doll from the 80s, and lastly, making light of the relatively silly concept of a person magically transforming their souls into a doll. Unfortunately, this opened the door to mocking other things about the franchise, and this is where things started to fall apart. Don Mancini took full control over the franchise at this point after Bride of Chucky, which caused a host of other issues, but we'll get to that later on in the video. When Seed of Chucky came out, I don't think Don Mancini was quite prepared for the onslaught of hate and criticism he was about to receive for the next 10 or so years of his career. People weren't happy with the silly tone, disrespect to Chucky's character, and the clumsy handling of the Glenda character that many people cite as one of the worst inclusions in the series' history. But why did people hate Seed of Chucky so much, and yet there was such a fondness for Bride of Chucky? Why was the jokey tone of Bride accepted, and yet Seed was so heavily panned for its humor? The reason lies in that tiny sliver of a thin line between comedy and horror. Yes, the horror comedy is littered with hilarious, horrific entries that people love. Films like Evil Dead 2, Beetlejuice, Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, Scary Movie, Shaun of the Dead, Hocus Pocus, and even somewhat more subtle entries like American Psycho and Cabin in the Woods. All of these movies are extremely different from one another in story, tone, acting, and writing, but the one thing they all nail in their own way is the correct tone that corresponds to its specific story. Chucky is something of a tricky concept to tackle, because when handled too comedically, it makes the whole story fall apart, and when handled too seriously, it turns the whole story into a bit of a joke that misses the whole point. Upon initial reveal of Chucky in the original Child's Play, things are played mostly straight, with extremely scary results. We're not meant to fully understand what's going on with this doll, or what his motives are. All we know is that this character is evil. Once revealed, however, the concept doesn't have anywhere else to go for a sequel except to ramp up the comedy. It's a little bit difficult for some people to accept a doll running around killing people when he's a third of a person's height. With every entry in the series, Chucky becomes a little bit more self-aware, as if to poke fun at the fact that he keeps coming back in the same doll every time and going on killing sprees for no real justifiable reason other than, well, it's fun. Fun being the key word here. It's as if the series had no choice but to acknowledge that, by its very own concept, it could not take itself seriously anymore. After 30-some years of Chucky killing people in the context of the story, we can't really expect him to have a good reason to keep coming back, other than that there is a fan base in the real world that wants him to. Which brings me to the doll. The concept. There is one glaring problem with the series that is an even bigger problem than people think, and it's heavily endemic to why Modern Chucky is such a failure, and that would be the concept itself. Child's Play tells the story of a serial killer in the 80s that transfers his soul to a doll that then goes on a killing spree while stalking a child to then put his soul into his body so that he may have everlasting life. This is a concept that is very much a product of its time when dolls were at their peak of popularity in our American culture. The reasons justifying Chucky's good guy doll form seem to get less and less relevant as time goes on, and dolls become more and more a thing of the past, an old vintage toy from a bygone era. Dolls like Chucky were popular in the 80s with such toys as Cabbage Patch Kids and My Buddy dolls. These toys started to fall out of popularity, however, with the onset of more advanced technology like video games taking center stage. Kids' dolls suddenly became boring and for kiddies, a fact that Bride of Chucky mocked to spectacular effect. In that movie, the inherent uncoolness of Chucky was played up to properly set up just how brutal of a killer he could be. This kind of subversion of the concept played more to the franchise's strengths rather than its weaknesses. Whenever people try to undermine or underestimate Chucky, he always has the last laugh. The question then becomes, how does Chucky keep being reincarnated into the same body year after year, long after the good guy doll was discontinued in the early 90s? How does Chucky keep being reincarnated into the same doll body every time? Well, there's a few ways they went around this problem in the series after Child's Play 3. Chucky's remains were gathered from an evidence locker in Bride of Chucky, which makes things relatively simple since this picks up canonically from how Child's Play 3 left off. It's a simple yet effective way to revive Chucky for the 90s in a way that gives him an appropriately edgy update to his design and changes the way his character now behaves in the film. He no longer has to play nice with children, and now his outside reflects his inside, which is also played to great effect in the film. Chucky was turned into an animatronic puppet in Seed of Chucky on the fake movie set based on the titular killer doll, making for perhaps the most self-aware Chucky doll in the series. Now Chucky wasn't simply a child's toy, but now an expensive piece of movie machinery, which changes things in a way that the series never really tries to fully capitalize on. This would be the first time Chucky comes back in a body that isn't purely made of plastic and rubber. But of course, this is never really addressed. Chucky needed prosthetic makeup in Curse of Chucky to hide his scars, presumably still in his same animatronic body from Seed of Chucky, a particularly ridiculous convention to make up for the fact that there are no factories churning out good guy dolls anymore. Now that he has to play nice with children again, he dons more of an innocent appearance to properly blend in with his surroundings. In Cult of Chucky, they offer no real explanation for how Chucky has so many seemingly new doll body counterparts. They just seem to pop up out of nowhere like rabbits. This is where the series starts to lose a bit of its footing, due to the voodoo concept going a little bit too far. As I mentioned before about tone, This slips things back into seed territory and upends the entire narrative as a result. That is until the Chucky TV series. In the show, he was treated more as something of a vintage collector's item to be bought and sold in garage sales or on eBay, but even then, Chucky kept coming back in multiple forms in the show. But the problem still remains that there is less and less justification for Chucky to retain this same form this late in the series. Why not another doll body? Why not a mannequin at a department store or something? Well, it's not as if the series creators haven't considered these possibilities, as I'm sure they have. The problem now lies not in the concept itself, but elsewhere: the branding. We're meant to accept this creative decision for the sheer fact that Chucky is a well-established character with a particular look and features. What this means is that Chucky is limited now by his branding in the real world. Red hair, blue eyes, overalls, and the same cherub-cheeked appearance. He must always look like a good guy doll, despite being out of production for almost 20 years, no matter how nonsensical to the plot of the story it becomes. Therefore, unfortunately, Chucky becomes a franchise that seems more and more to be a product of its time than an enduring franchise that can go on forever. This means that this series has a shelf life, and we may very well be past that expiration date. This brings me to my next point. Don Mancini. Don Mancini is the reason the entire Chucky franchise exists, and why the franchise has kept going up until this point within the same universe since the original film. That's right, every single film in the series is canon, a tough feat to accomplish in any horror franchise. He originally wrote a screenplay called Blood Buddy that formed the basis of what would eventually become Child's Play in 1988. Tom Holland came on board to direct the film to give it some much-needed grounding and was able to make it more relatable to the average moviegoer. The original concept for Blood Buddy saw the child mixing its blood with synthetic blood from the doll, therefore making it come alive at night and committing murder on behalf of the child's unconscious rage. It would have been a much more cerebral film than what we eventually got, and the entire concept changed when producer David Kirshner suggested putting the soul of a serial killer in the doll's body instead. After this, seemingly everything clicked into place, and thus, Chucky was born. At this point, Don Mancini had a great team of creatives by his side, helping him flesh out the story, and yet at the same time, kept him grounded and focused on the story being told. John LaFia would come on board to direct one of the series' most popular entries, Child's Play 2, after helping write the first movie. Once Child's Play 3 rolled around, the series all but ran out of steam completely and failed to make much of a mark at the box office, making less than half the gross profit of the original film at $20 million. The third film saw a rushed development cycle coming out less than a year after the release of Child's Play 2, and ensured the series' slow, inevitable demise of your typical 80s slasher villain. 8 years later, in 1998, we were treated by the reboot of Child's Play in Bride of Chucky, and this marked a turning point for the murderous doll, choosing to focus more than ever on Chucky's wisecracking, psychotic personality, rather than keeping him as the main antagonist. Now he was much more of a main character protagonist than ever before, yet still keeping within his monstrous identity from the first 3 films. Bride of Chucky was a huge success, grossing just over $50 million, even more than the original film did in 1988. Which brings us to Seed of Chucky, coming out 6 years later and completely failed as a follow-up to Bride of Chucky. It failed commercially, critically, and it created such a backlash with the fans that it single-handedly destroyed any future the franchise could possibly have. If there's one film in the series that was the central junction point of the franchise, it's Seed of Chucky, as it set the tone for the next 2 decades. But what was the main problem with Seed of Chucky? Well, without going into too much detail, the simple answer is that Don Mancini was left to his own devices. The reason the previous films in the series saw so much success is not just due to Don Mancini's writing, but also because of the creative team he kept around him. David Kirshner still helps Don produce the films, but after Don took creative control over the series, it's never been quite the same since. Even though films like Curse, Cult, and the Chucky TV series have all come along to try to address and correct these sins of the past, there are elements of Seed in every single movie and episode since then, all because they're under the direction of Don Mancini. Don't get me wrong, Don Mancini can create some very interesting and creative situations, stories, and characters within his post-Bride Chucky series. However, the problem here is the execution. A character like Redman, for example, might have been an interesting character within the story of Seed, but tonally speaking, he doesn't fit within the series' identity set for itself within the first 4 films. He feels more like an insert for typical Hollywood sleazeball than anything that fits within the universe of the Chucky films. The characters in Chucky films are usually always grounded, normal people, with Chucky being the outlier causing havoc in all their lives, a formula that has worked in every single entry before Seed of Chucky. Certain characters are meant to stand out, such as Tiffany Valentine or the CEO in Child's Play 2 and 3, to make a point about the story itself, not to distract from it. With the Chucky TV series, Don Mancini might direct an episode that goes from serious to campy in 2 seconds flat. The tone is something that is constantly in flux, and that is a big problem that continues to worm its way into every single Chucky product since Seed of Chucky. Ironically, it's not as big a problem in Seed of Chucky because Don knew exactly what he wanted to make with that film. He was completely unfettered in his creative control, which highlights the main problem with the series since Bride of Chucky. The reason for this is simple. Don Mancini wants to make Chucky a comedy, but the fans want Chucky to remain a horror icon. Thus, even when Don Mancini tries to write Chucky for scares and thrills, he simply can't help but insert his absurdist sensibility within every single entry to some degree. Just when we try to take Chucky seriously, Don undercuts this with an absurdist plot point, character, or scene. He never allows the viewer to become comfortable. This brings us back to tone, and the reason why the series fell apart to begin with, because of the inability or straight-up refusal for Don Mancini to keep Chucky within a consistent tone. This lack of tonal consistency confused audiences and turned off more and more people over the years until Don literally couldn't get a budget together for a large-scale Chucky film until he proved some success with Curse and Cult, after which Universal finally let Don Mancini have a bit more money for a TV series venture. And yet the problems with the series remain. The Chucky TV show frequently had off-the-wall stories and plots, frequently making the viewer ask the question, why did they do that? The final season saw Chucky go to the White House and meet a fictionalized president of the United States, a decision I can only deduce was made out of desperation for something big to keep the series in the public consciousness. But it did little to keep fans interested, hence why the Chucky TV series was canceled after just 3 seasons. So what's next for Chucky at this point? Can anything be fixed about this series at this point, or is it doomed to suffer franchise obscurity alongside other legacy slasher icons like Freddy and Jason? Honestly, the fact that Chucky films and a TV series continue to even still be made today is a triumph to the longevity of the series, the passion of its fans, and the endurance of, yes, Don Mancini himself to keep the series going. The development team of the Chucky franchise today is more or less a close-knit group of friends. Don Mancini, Jennifer Tilly, Brad Dourif, his daughter, and other series veterans have all stuck together throughout pretty much every iteration of the series since Bride of Chucky. The closeness of this team has both compelled the series forward as well as kept it stagnant in many ways. Not all great films are made by people who like each other, but by the perfect storm of talent, opportunity, and skill involved. Perhaps that will change in the future if Chucky still has one, or Chucky may well peter out and see its demise. Brad Dourif is pretty old these days, and he has even retired his on-screen acting career, capping things off in the Chucky TV series finale. As far as I can tell, he's still willing to keep coming back as the titular villain in voice only, but for how much longer can he voice the character until it's no longer feasible for him to do so? Can anyone replace Brad's voice? We may very well see the end of Chucky sooner than you think, as I don't think Don Mancini would want to continue the series if Brad was no longer able to play the character. It's been a long and tumultuous ride for Chucky, his fans, and all the development team involved. Perhaps it's best to leave things as they are, or perhaps Chucky deserves one final stab to cap the series off on a high note. The only question is, will Don Mancini be able to do it? Only time will tell. But what do you guys think? Do you agree with my reasoning for why Modern Chucky is failing? Or do you have a differing take? Let me know in the comments below. I would like to thank all of you for watching and all my monetary supporters for helping keep this channel going. Please see my description for links to support me, and I will see you all in the next video. Until then, stay tuned.